Before we get into the case today, I love doing Murderess, and I know a lot of you love listening to it. There's now a way for you to help keep the show going and help with production costs through a monthly donation. Just scroll to the bottom of the episode description and click the support link. I really appreciate it.
You hear good things.
Thanksgiving weekend, 1991. Costa Mesa, California. It was the kind of apartment complex where people kept to themselves. A place where lives ran quiet until the holiday night when everything changed. Neighbors later said that the first thing they noticed was the sound. Not shouting, not a fight, but the garbage disposal. Running and running and running. Long past midnight, another noise began to surface underneath it. A steady, deliberate rhythm. A chopping sound. Metal against wood. Wood against bone. A sound no one recognized until it became a sound they would never forget. Inside apartment C, the kitchen lights burned hot. Red lipstick, red heels, a red hat. A woman moving with a strange, trance-like focus. Slicing, boiling, cleaning, as if she were working through steps she couldn't allow herself to think about too deeply. On a stove, a pot simmered. In the freezer, something heavy cooled under a layer of frost. And in the sink, water swirled pink in slow, dissolving circles. It would take detectives hours to piece together what happened in that apartment, and decades for the public to understand the woman at the center of it all. But before the lies changed shape, before the stories collided, before the courtroom heard the most shocking details in Orange County history, there was only this. A Thanksgiving night when a newlywed woman said she feared for her life, and a husband who had never walked out of the apartment again. By the time police opened the door, the holiday was over, and the honeymoon was gone with it. I'm Sidney Smith, and this is Murderess Podcast. This week's Murderess is Omaima Nelson in A Thanksgiving in Blood. Before we move forward, a quick reminder of where we are in this story. This is the life of a woman who always insisted she was a victim long before she was ever called a killer. A life shaped by wounds that began in childhood. Wounds she carried across an ocean when she left Egypt and tried to reinvent herself in America. It's the story of a young immigrant who arrived with almost nothing, who slipped into the cracks of a place where no one asked too many questions, of a romance that was fast, intoxicating, and within 3 weeks, already unraveling into fear, control, and violence. And whether you believe her version of events or the prosecution's, her path from abused wife to accused murderer wasn't a straight line. It was a storm gathering long before anyone saw what was coming. She was born in southern Egypt, one of 16 children in a home where the needs of the youngest often disappeared beneath the weight of the oldest. Survival was not a concept. It was the daily atmosphere. Discipline came as beatings. Privacy didn't exist. And at 6 years old, she was taken into a small room, held down, and subjected to forced female circumcision. It's the kind of trauma that doesn't just wound a child. It rearranges the way she learns to navigate danger, power, and pain. Through her teens, she carried those lessons in silence. You didn't cry, and a lot of us grew up that way, so we can understand that part. Because you didn't cry. You endured. You found ways to protect yourself that didn't rely on anyone else's mercy. And depending on who you believe, those early survival instincts became the blueprint for the woman she would later become. By the mid-1980s, she left Egypt for the United States. She arrived in California with no real safety net, no family, and no money. What she did bring was the one skill she had mastered early: reinvention. In just a few years, she cycled through identities. She was a model, a nanny, party girl, girlfriend, runaway, survivor. People who met her described her as intoxicating. Just the type of person who's just so magnetic, impossible to forget, but also difficult to truly know. Every version of herself felt polished, curated, and temporary. And in this country, she learned something else. Older men, especially wealthy, lonely ones, those are the type that can open doors. She dated them, flirted with them, even lived with them. Sometimes it was companionship. Other times, it was a kind of transaction she didn't name, but clearly understood. That charm, though, came with a darker pattern that followed her from place to place. Police reports from those years capture glimpses of behavior that would later haunt her murder trial. A security guard who says she attacked him during an argument. A boyfriend tied to a chair during what she said was consensual bondage play, only for him to claim she threatened him with a knife. Another man who said she bound him to the bed and then tried to rob him. Each incident came with the same two versions of the story. Her version: they were abusive. They hurt me. I was protecting myself. This was survival. The prosecution's version: this is a pattern. Men tied up, restrained, threatened, robbed. Not a reaction, a tactic. The truth, like much of her life, lives somewhere in the tension between those narratives. But the pattern itself is important because by the time she met Bill Nelson, a man twice her age, fresh out of prison, lonely enough to fall instantly in love, she already understood two things with absolute clarity. Men could be dangerous, and identity could be armor or a weapon. They met in October of 1991 in the kind of bar where the jukebox hums under the sound of pool balls snapping apart. Bill Nelson is 56, tall, confident, with the swagger of a man who's lived a harder life than he admits. A former pilot, a former drug smuggler, a man used to the thrill of reinvention. And across from him stands a woman who has built her entire life on reinvention. The story goes that Bill watched her play a game of pool, leaned in to compliment her shot, and Omaima let him. Because for her, attention was currency, safety, power, maybe even affection. What Bill saw as charm, she understood as something different. Within days, not weeks, not months, they were married. A shotgun romance without the shotgun. Friends later said it was dizzying, almost reckless. But people wrote it off as passion, as two adults moving fast forward whatever they thought the other could offer. The honeymoon was not a flight to some island. It was a road trip. Texas, Oklahoma, and back toward California. Long highways, cheap motels, and two people who barely knew each other sharing the same car, the same bed, and the same shifting stories about who they were. And later, when everything was over, Omaima would paint a picture of that trip as a descent into hell. She said Bill demanded sex multiple times a day, that he bruised her, that he beat her when she said no, that he threatened to have her deported if she didn't cooperate. She said he threw her kitten out of the car window, that he handcuffed her, raped her, broke her down mile by mile. Those were her claims. A narrative threaded through trauma, immigration fear, and her own history of abuse. The defense leaned on that story hard. Psychiatrists described PTSD bubbling underneath her surface, psychosis triggered by old scars. They tried to explain her actions through a lifetime of being dominated by men. But the prosecution and Bill's family pushed back with equal force. Bill's ex-wife stood firmly behind him, saying he had never raised a hand to her, that violence wasn't part of his character. And unlike Omaima's story, there was no medical evidence of sexual assault, no hospital photographs, no police reports from the honeymoon route. What the investigators did find later in the apartment were marks on Bill's wrist. But those didn't support her claims of being the only one restrained. They suggested something else entirely, something that would matter a great deal once the crime scene unfolded. So the honeymoon becomes the fulcrum of this case, a place where the story split. Her version, escalated abuse, terror, and the fear of being trapped in a foreign country with a man who controlled every part of her life. The prosecution's version, a woman who had learned long before meeting Bill how to gain power by dominating before she could be dominated herself. And the truth, whatever it was, is trapped somewhere in those long stretches of highway, in the silences between gas stations, in the nights where only the two of them knew what really happened. Thanksgiving Day, 1991. In most homes, the smell of turkey drifts through hallways, just like it's yours right now. And the noise of family fills every room, just like in your home at this moment or maybe later today. But in 1991, inside Bill and Omaima Nelson's Costa Mesa apartment, there is no celebration, no gathering, no tradition. Just two people alone in a place already straining under the weight of whatever happened on that honeymoon drive. According to her, the night begins with bondage. Something she says Bill demanded. Something she says she agreed to out of fear. Her version paints a scene where she's handcuffed to the bed, where consent becomes confusion, then becomes panic, then becomes a fight for her life. She claims he assaulted her, raped her, that she felt herself losing control of her own body and her own future. That's her story. What we know for certain is that she got free. And once she did, the violence that followed was sudden, chaotic, and unstoppable. She grabbed a pair of scissors, a household pair, sharp enough, close enough, and stabbed him repeatedly. The coroner would later confirm multiple stab wounds, deep enough to show intention, frantic enough to show panic. Then came the blunt force trauma. Investigators believe she took an iron, the kind used for laundry, and struck him in the face and skull again and again. By the time the struggle was over, Bill Nelson was dead. What happened next is where this story veers into territory that has haunted Orange County for more than 3 decades. Not because it is gruesome, though it is. Not because it is disturbing, because it's that too. But because the psychology behind it is far more complex than the headlines ever captured. Omaima later described entering a kind of trance, a dissociative fog, if you will, a place where time stretched out and she moved through the apartment with a kind of mechanical calm. For approximately 12 hours, she dismembered Bill's body. She boiled his head. She fried his hands in oil, which is a method consistent with removing fingerprints. She skinned portions of his torso. She wrapped pieces in newspaper, in tinfoil, in plastic bags. She placed some parts in the freezer, others in the refrigerator, some in the trash, and other pieces in suitcases. And mixed in with what she discarded were the leftovers from Thanksgiving. Turkey bones, scraps of food, pieces of wrapping. A holiday table collapsed into evidence. The garbage disposal ran for hours. The blades burned out. Maintenance workers later testified that the sink itself had to be dismantled to remove the clog of bone, tissue, and metal fragments. And here's the piece investigators could never forget. The detail that kept the crime scene technicians awake at night long after the case closed. Bill Nelson weighed roughly 230 pounds. Only about 150 pounds were ever recovered. 80 pounds of this man were still missing. Those 80 pounds became the heart of the rumor mill. People whispered about cannibalism, about ritual, about psychosis. But the truth is simpler and somehow more chilling. No one knows where that missing weight went. No one ever found it. And the absence itself became the most haunting part of the forensic record. When police finally arrived, tipped off by a friend of Bill's who sensed something was wrong, they didn't walk into a crime scene. They walked into the aftermath of a psychological break, a cover-up, and perhaps a lifetime of trauma converging in one catastrophic moment. There's a moment in every investigation where the story someone tells finally collapses under the weight of the evidence. For Costa Mesa police, that moment began the second Omaima Nelson got behind the wheel of Bill's red Corvette. Because the morning after Thanksgiving, she didn't go into hiding. She didn't panic. She went visiting. She drove the Corvette from one ex-boyfriend's house to another, still wearing bandages on her hands and cuts across her chest, telling each man a different version of the same plea. help me. At the home of Richard Gray in Anaheim, she showed up carrying a trash bag. Inside it, what she said were turkey leftovers. Before he opened the door, she whispered that Bill had sexually assaulted her, that she'd fought back, that she needed him to help her get rid of what was left. Gray refused. He told her to leave. And when she walked away with that trash bag, he immediately called police. But the unraveling happened even faster at the next house. In the early hours of December 2nd, she knocked on another door, this time holding an actual bag of body parts. She promised this man appliances, a Corvette, and $75,000 from a safe she said was hidden in the apartment. All he had to do was help her get rid of everything. He agreed to help, and as soon as she stepped outside to wait for his truck, he called 911. When the officers arrived at the Costa Mesa apartment, the smell hit them before the door even opened. Inside, they found separate containers of human remains scattered through the living room and kitchen. A trash bag in the car. A deep fryer. Remember the deep fryer? Containing those 2 human hands. They found those fried in cooking oil. A cooler in the freezer holding Bill Nelson's boiled, skinless head. A soup pot filled with cooked tissue. Blood soaked into the furniture. Blood splashed across the walls. Blood seeping into the floorboards. Scissors. Knives. A broken iron with pieces of scalp still attached. Tools that had been heated, wiped, and reheated again. Everywhere they turned, they found cutting, burning, cleaning, retrying. And everywhere they looked, they found only 2 people's DNA, Bill's and Omaima's. No signs of a break-in, no forced door, no other footprints, no signs of a third party, nothing. But when officers questioned her, she gave a brand new version of events. This time, Omaima said she didn't kill him at all. She said 2 women and 3 men broke into the apartment while she was asleep. They tied her up. They murdered Bill. And then they planted all the body parts just to frame her. But the blood splatter told a different story. It showed everyone that this was a prolonged, solitary cleanup. Garbage disposal blades still clogged with human tissue. Hot water tracks from the bathtub where she tried to rinse away pieces of him. And the Corvette key in her purse. Investigators believe she tried to create a narrative of chaos, but the evidence showed method. And then came the moment that investigators still remember. Weighing those remains. Bill Nelson stood 6'4", weighed 230 pounds. And as I mentioned before, police recovered roughly 150 pounds of him. So that means that left 80 pounds, an entire third of his body, still unaccounted for. By the time Omaima Nelson entered a Santa Ana courtroom in December 1992, the case had already taken on a life of its own. Reporters described it as the most gruesome crime in the history of the county. But inside that courtroom, the spectacle gave way to something more controlled, more strategic. Because this wasn't just a murder trial. It was a clash of two entirely different stories about the same woman. When we get down and we're dealing with what was happening at that time, we can go ahead and start with the charges, because right at that moment is when you see everything start to diverge. Because the prosecutors wanted first-degree murder. They argued premeditation, planning, and intentional killing. But the jury would ultimately return a verdict of second-degree murder. Not because they believed she was innocent, but because they couldn't agree on motive. From the very beginning, the defense built its case on the idea that Omaima was a victim long before she ever became a killer. They brought psychologists to the stand who spoke of battered woman syndrome, of post-traumatic stress disorder, of the cultural trauma of forced genital mutilation at 6 years old. They painted her as a woman who had never once been safe in her own body. Not in Egypt, not in adolescence, not in adulthood, and certainly not in marriage. They argued that her marriage to Bill followed the same pattern: older men exploiting her, using her, threatening her. They insisted what happened on Thanksgiving was a psychotic break triggered by sexual assault. But the prosecution had a very different story. They documented a pattern that went back years, not of survival, but of control. Older men chosen for their vulnerability. Bondage scenarios where she did the tying. Ex-boyfriends who described being held at gunpoint while she demanded money. A sexual game that shifted instantly into robbery. To the prosecution, Omaima didn't stumble into violence. She escalated into it. They argued Bill Nelson was not a monster, and no evidence showed he'd ever been violent before. Again, his ex-wife, she had testified he was never abusive. A medical exam found no signs of sexual trauma on Omaima after Thanksgiving. But Bill's body told its own story. Marks on his wrist. Not his hands tying her down, but someone tying him down. Then came the psychiatrist. He testified that Omaima told him she dressed up in red pumps, red lipstick, a red hat, sat at the kitchen table, and cooked her husband's ribs, just like in a restaurant, quote unquote. That she tasted them, said they were sweet. Later, she denied every bit of it. Denied the cannibalism. Denied meaning the words. Denied the trance-like state he described. But the brutality of the dismemberment and the cold, methodical cleanup supported at least one part of his diagnosis. She was in some kind of psychotic episode. The jury deliberated 6 days. And when they returned, their verdict fell right between the two narratives. A murder committed intentionally, but not proven to be premeditated. Second-degree murder. 28 years to life. But that wasn't the end. Because after the trial came the parole hearings. In 2006, and again in 2011, the Orange County District Attorney's Office didn't just file paperwork opposing release. They sent the original prosecutor, Senior Deputy DA Randy Pulaski, to the prison in person. Now that almost never happens, folks. He told the board she was still manipulative, still unpredictable, still dangerous, still unwilling to take responsibility. And he wasn't alone. Her prison record showed fights, battery on staff, contraband, disciplinary violations, and no participation in any rehab programs. But the moment that would define both hearings came from Bill Nelson's daughter, Margaret. She stood before the board, a grown woman holding a written statement, hands shaking, and said she never got to introduce her newborn daughter to her father. She never got to dance with him at her wedding. She never got to bury him because there wasn't enough of him left to bury. And then she looked directly at the commissioners and said, I don't know the adequate punishment for a murderer who doesn't even leave a family a body to mourn over. But I do know you don't let her out. You've been listening to a production of Sidney Smith Creative, LLC, and the You Hear Good Things Podcast Network. All rights reserved. This episode is based on court records, police files, and contemporary reporting. Any reconstructed moments are grounded in verified evidence and are never used to change the facts of the case. For more true crime stories to stay with you, follow Murderess Podcast on your favorite platform and join the quiet jury community on Creative Plus for early access, bonus content, and deeper cuts. Go to Sidney Smith Creative, that's CRE8TV.com, and click the Creative Plus tab. Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious.